Good morning, everybody. I want to thank everybody for being here on a muggy Sunday morning. That's nice to say. A little steamy out there. I'll take it. We are today concluding our study of persecution. And Steve and I have thrown a lot your way and a lot of do's and don'ts the last, 3 to 4 weeks. And in the moment of persecution, you're probably not going to be able to go through a checklist of things you're supposed to do and not do. So I'm hoping today that when we look at the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that we're going to see that really it comes down to two truths that you need to have in your heart. And if those two truths are there, you're going to be fine, no matter come what may. So we're going to take a look at that. We're going to do quite a bit of scripture reading, and that's why we have a PowerPoint today with this picture that probably was in one of my childhood Bible story books of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But we're going to go back and start maybe 100 years before these young men came on the scene and take a look at the setting in which they found themselves there in the book of Daniel, how they got where they were, and the implications that it might have had on them, and the similarities that might exist between their time and ours, and hopefully give us a little bit of confidence with respect to the challenges that we face today. Next week, we'll begin a study of the book of Philippians. Steve and I have chosen that. We've talked about salt and light, and we've talked about persecution, which seem to be complementary, right? If you're salt and you're light, you're going to get noticed, you're going to be persecuted. And if you're persecuted, you're going to need joy. And that's what the book of Philippians is all about. And so we'll be looking at that. We're also going to look at similar passages throughout the New Testament. So the themes that we see in Philippians, we're going to jump around and see how they're just echoing themes that maybe Christ had preached in the Gospels or that are found in other letters as well, and just cover it that way. So a little bit of a twist, a little bit of a unique approach, but focusing on Philippians for a quarter isn't going to hurt anybody, I don't think. But as we mentioned and have mentioned several times, and Steve emphasized this last week, and the legislation that he mentioned with respect to persecution actually, I believe, has been brought up and is being debated now in our Congress in D.C. But we know the government is increasingly hostile to those of us who believe the Bible and practice New Testament Christianity. And, it's pretty alarming when we stand back and take a look at it. And the reality is that our government is just ultimately a reflection of we the people, isn't it? They're not that dissimilar from us. They derive their power from us. We elect them. We put them in these places of power. They run on ideas, and people either certify those ideas as being worthy or not and vote accordingly. But we have problems in America that go beyond the government, and actually, as I alluded to, are the source of the problems of government. Consider some of these statistics about our United States of America. 50% of marriages end in divorce. Up to 60% of all marriages will deal with at least one form of infidelity over the lifetime of the marriage. Over 600,000 children are aborted every year. That's more than one per minute. 35.2% of 12th graders and 11.4% of 8th graders have used marijuana in the last year. It's almost 1 out of every 8 8th graders have used marijuana in the last year. 55.3% of 12th graders and 20.5% of 8th graders have consumed alcohol in the past year. 12% of all internet websites are pornographic. 25% of all online search engine requests are related to sex. That's 68 million requests per day. 35% of all internet downloads are pornographic, 1 out of every 3. 40 million Americans are regular visitors to porn sites. 70% of men aged 18 to 24 visit a porn site at least once per month. The average age of first exposure to internet porn is 11. And just 55% of adults 25 and older believe that pornography is wrong. 1 in 3 girls are sexually abused before the age of 18. 1 in 5 boys are sexually abused before the age of 18. There are nearly 500,000 registered sex offenders in the United States, and a typical pedophile will commit 117 sexual crimes in a lifetime. The percent of Americans who absolutely believe in the existence of God has dropped from 71% to 63% between 2007 and 2014. Over that same period, the percentage attending services at least once per week dropped from 39% to 36%. 33% of Americans say there are clear standards for what is right and wrong. That leaves 67% that believe there are not clear standards of what is right and what is wrong. And between 2007 and 2014, the percentage of Americans who think homosexuality should be accepted went from 50% to 62%. If only there were some stories of people in corrupt societies, in immoral societies, in societies that turned their back on God, that stood strong in the face of that. If only there were some examples of trust in God and perseverance through persecution. If only there was an example of how people could thrive in a godless society and stand strong in the face of the power of kings. I want to look at one of these today, and of course it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I want us to get a good dose of what Paul calls in Romans 15 and verse 4, the patience and comfort of the Scriptures. That's the reason the Old Testament is there for us, not only to serve as a bedrock of our faith and to show us God's hand throughout history, and how he had built his people and established his plan of salvation, but ultimately to give us patience and comfort through those lessons that we learn. I want us to see that whatever we go through or may go through in our lifetime is nothing new. And I want us to leave here ready for the fiery darts that Satan will surely throw our way. And like I said, I want to make it really simple today. So when you boil it all down, I think there are two truths, like I said earlier, that we need to have hidden in our hearts. And those are manifest in Daniel 3, verses 16 through 18. If you want to turn there, fine. We're going to be doing a lot of reading in Daniel today, a lot of reading, period, but a lot in Daniel. So if you want to go ahead and go there, that'll be great. But in verses 16 through 18 of chapter 3, Daniel says this: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So the two truths here are, one, God's bigger than my problem. Whatever my problem is, he has sufficient power, sufficient ability to deliver me through it. And of course, the love and the desire to bring us through it as well. That one's established whether we believe it or not. God is bigger than all of our problems. That's a truth. Truth two, we have some say in. Truth two that we need to have in our heart is that if God doesn't choose to deliver us, we will not forsake him. That's where it gets a little tricky. And we have to have that hidden in our heart, that no matter come what may, we will remain faithful to God and to his teachings, to his commandments, and not turn our back on him, not deny him, no matter the cost to us on this earth. So like I said, we're going to go back about 100 years or so before Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came on the scene. We're going to start in 2 Kings 17. We're going to look at verses 6 through 20. These are words spoken to the king of Israel, talking about their disobedience, the moral decay that had taken place in God's people, and what God was going to do. And then he says at the end that Judah also had not kept these commandments and was essentially guilty of all the same things. So the divided kingdom, northern Israel, southern Judah, was guilty. Blood was on their hands, literally and figuratively, with respect to their actions. So 2 Kings 17, verses 6 through 20. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Hala, and on the Habor, the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. And they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this." Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers, and that I sent to you by my servants, the prophets." But they would not listen, but were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false, and they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves, and they made an Asherah, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. And they burned their sons and their daughters as offerings, and used divination and omens, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, and afflicted them, and gave them into the hand of plunderers, until he had cast them out of his sight. Particularly striking to me is that they offered their own children to false gods. I just can't imagine that. Your crying, screaming child going into a fire or being butchered as a sacrifice. But how different is modern day America with abortion, or with offering our kids up to materialism, to the pleasures of the world, and emphasizing things that are not godly and sending them on a path towards destruction. Is that any better than what we read about in Israel? I'm not sure that it is. So let's fast forward a few decades. The Israelites had now been carried away into Assyria, and Judah, the tribe that remained, was about to be carried away into a foreign land as well. Jeremiah 25, 1 through 11. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, that was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, which Jeremiah the prophet spoke to all the people of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. For 23 years, from the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah, to this day, the word of the Lord has come to me, and I have spoken persistently to you, but you have not listened. You have neither listened nor inclined your ears to hear, although the Lord persistently sent to you all his servants, the prophets, saying, "Turn now, every one of you, from his evil way and evil deeds, and dwell upon the land that the Lord has given to you and your fathers from old and forever. Do not go after gods to serve and worship them, or provoke me to anger with the work of your hands. Then I will do you no harm. Yet you have not listened to me, declares the Lord, that you might provoke me to anger with the work of your hands to do your own harm. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, And I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction, and make them a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will banish from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the grinding of the millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. This is kind of depressing, isn't it? That these people whom God had given so much, had brought them out of slavery and had given them the abundance of Canaan and had provided them protection and won battles for them, they, bit by bit, had turned their back on him to the point where, they lose the scrolls of the law, right? And it's just passed down verbally, and what is passed down is manipulated or changed, and people aren't obeying God. They're not seeking God. Daniel continues and introduces us to our heroes for the day. Daniel chapter 1. He says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. There are 2 ways to account for time. There's sort of the Jewish way and the Babylonian way. And say somebody started in November, their kingship in November. One way would say, this is their 1st year, this November to December period. And then their 2nd year begins in January. Others wouldn't count that incomplete year. So it's not an inconsistency. It's just 2 different methods of time. And Daniel, of course, was in Babylon and had been trained in the Babylonian schools there for a period of at least 3 years. So it's not surprising that he would count it a little bit differently. So you can all sleep at night knowing that this is not a contradiction of the Holy Spirit. But in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, just as Jeremiah had been saying for 23 years, right? And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. We're going to see a little bit later on that among these youths that were of the royal family and nobility who met these criteria were Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so what do we know about these young men from this passage? These young men that grew up in this society that was so awful that we talked about, the depraved culture that existed at the time of the writing here in both Israel and Judah. Well, they were young, they were good looking, they were wise beyond their years, they were smart, they were good students, and they were competent young men. And they're leaving, albeit against their will, for a land, they're leaving the land that will be desolate in a few years, as Jeremiah had promised, into the riches of the king's palace in Babylon. You might think that things are going great for them, right? To stay behind where there will be no joy, no production of agriculture and all the things that had been prophesied, and being able to go to a place that was rich, and you were going to be in the richest area of one of the richest nations. You could think, hey, this is going pretty good. And you could pat yourself on the back saying, I've, all of the things that I have, my youth, my good looks, my wisdom, my smarts, my ability to learn, and my competency have really put me in a good place. I think the lesson here for us is not to get lulled to sleep by success or good fortune. It's not an invisibility cloak against persecution. These young men are going to be persecuted. And the lesson is also to value yourself as God values you, right? You can use all of these things that are mentioned here in service to God, but if you don't have these things, you can still be pleasing to God. So if we're patting ourselves on the back for all the good things that we have, and that's how we value ourselves and how we assign our worth, there's a real danger that when persecution comes, we're going to shrivel and we're not going to persist. These young men did not shrivel. And perhaps soon we're met with uncomfortable realities in their new world, which will sort of start this yo-yo process, as I'm going to refer to it through the lesson today, of, hey, this is great. Whoa, this isn't so great. Hey, this is great. Whoa, this is not so great. So there's sort of a yo-yo going on here in the lives of these young men, much as was in the life of Joseph, right? Preferred son, sold into slavery, put over the house, sent to prison, back in Pharaoh. You know, it's a very similar path, and it's a path that if we follow God, we're going to travel as well. Things are going to be great for a while, and then things are going to seem difficult. And then we're going to pass that test, and things are going to get better, and we're going to have the next persecution or the next temptation. It's interesting to consider the prophecy of Isaiah in 2 Kings 20, verses 16 through 18. This one won't be on the screen. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, and some of your own sons who come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." So there's a probably better than average chance that these young men, when they were brought to Babylon, were emasculated. Perhaps the first sign that things weren't as great as they seemed to be yesterday. But they were blessed in living in their homeland. Then their homeland was besieged, and they were taken to a foreign land. But then they got to stand in the king's palace. But then they were emasculated. Let's continue reading to see what happens in the lives of these young men. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. As you know, in Jewish culture, the names meant things, right? And they were often reflective of someone's personality. And they would get nicknames that would reflect their personality, right? Barnabas, son of encouragement. Hananiah meant Yahweh, or God, has been gracious. But his name was changed to the command of Aku, who was the moon god of the Babylonians. Mishael means who is what El is, or who is what God is. It was changed to who is this. Azariah means Yahweh has helped. His name was changed to servant of the god Nabu. Are there lessons for us here? I think so. People may try to change you. They may mock you. And they may call you names. But none of that changes who you are unless you let it. And these young men did not. Continuing in verse 8 then. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, "I fear my lord the king, who assigns your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king?" Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see." So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Why couldn't the Hebrews eat the king's food? We're not told explicitly. Maybe it was barbecue ribs and catfish, both of which would have been unclean. Probably not the Babylonian delicacies, but you never know. It could have been things that just God had said, you can't eat these animals. Or it could very well have been animals that were clean, but had been offered as a sacrifice to an idol, and thus were unclean by the way that they had been used. In either case, Daniel and these young men stood up and refused to partake, having vegetables and water for 10 days. I would probably die because I need meat. I'm not a big veggie fan, as many of you know. But is there a lesson for us today in this paragraph, in this passage? I think there is. Persecution may be subtle and easy to hide from, right? These men could have just kind of moved, as I've learned to do over the years, moved the food around their plate and avoid certain things, and, nobody would have been any the wiser. They could have just eaten it and said, well, I don't know for sure if it was offered. But their conscience wouldn't let them do that. In their minds, it was unclean and unacceptable to do this. So they stood up, and they put a target on their backs as a result of their stand. But when we do this, God looks favorably on us and prepares us for bigger and deeper tests of our faith and of our resolve, as we're going to see take place in the lives of these young men. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke to them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all the kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. How easy would it have been for these young men, as pure, as able, and as faithful as they were, to have had self-pity, right? To not buy into their situation, but to sit back, dig in their heels, and say, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to learn anything. This is not what I bargained for. But they didn't do that. They went about their business. They accepted the task at hand, even though they didn't know how necessarily it was going to be used, how God was going to use this learning, this ability that they might get. They chose to prosper and to accept God's blessing and to be ready for the next chapter. They essentially went off to college for 3 years to study things like astronomy, architecture, and languages. They very easily could have asked the age-old question, when am I ever going to need that? Like so many do of algebra and calculus and things of that nature. I prefer to ask that about cultural anthropology, which I took in college. I don't know that I've ever really used that so much, but God's blessing and their acceptance of it put them in a place of influence and extraordinary ability, even in a foreign and pagan land of Babylon. So when persecution forces us into situations that we don't like, they're not our ideal, have no room in your heart for self-pity. Have no room in your heart for doing anything less than your best to serve God. Even if it doesn't seem like it's going to be beneficial to anyone, it may in fact be beneficial to an entire nation, as the faith of these men ultimately will be. Hate to ruin the ending for you, but it turns out pretty good for these guys. Let's look at Daniel chapter 2. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled and his sleep left him. And the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans, which is another word for these magicians and sorcerers, said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you're trying to gain time. He's accusing them of stalling, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation." The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." Because of this, the king was very angry. That's a recurring theme here in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. He has an anger problem, but in this case, he was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. That would, of course, include Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they were certainly wise, and their wisdom was 10 times that of sort of the native Babylonians there. It's amazing to me that they were not called to Nebuchadnezzar's side to interpret, but apparently they were not. So the decree went out, verse 13, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and direction to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" And Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. It's interesting here in verse 16, Daniel says, "Set up some time for me to go tell the king the interpretation of the dream." And then he goes back and says, "All right, guys, we got to figure this out. What's the interpretation of this dream? We should go to God with this difficulty." And indeed they did. And you're going to see that, of course, Daniel interprets that dream, much to the delight of Nebuchadnezzar and to the reward of these young men. But the lesson for us here in this passage that we've just read, I think, is that the spiritual yo-yo continues. They had seemingly been forgotten and passed over, and the king had seemingly ignored their 10x wisdom that they had relative to those of Babylonian heritage. And because we're not like the people of the world, kings and rulers and others will forget us, even though we can offer so much help. We must remain consistent and persistent in all the ebbs and flows that we're going to encounter. Another lesson for us with respect to persecution is that we don't have to fight our battles alone. Daniel was in a battle, and what did he do? He went to his faithful friends so that they could fight it together. Do you have people that will go to battle with and for you? You do, whether you know it or not. There are people who will go to battle with you and for you. And if you're facing persecution, temptation, or trouble, you need to let somebody know. Oftentimes we're too independent. It's sort of our heritage, right? Self-serving, self-sufficient, independent. It is not a sign of weakness to trouble someone with your troubles. Sometimes we're perhaps prideful, or we think that others will truly be troubled with our troubles and we don't want to burden them. If you go to someone with your troubles and exemplify trust that you have in them and give them a chance to serve you, and they accept that opportunity and serve God with you and through you, you're doing that person a favor. They're going to grow. You're going to grow. So don't fight your battles alone. Last lesson to point out from this passage is that when people sought to kill them, their instinct was to pray. When people sought to harm them, their instinct was to pray, to go to God for mercy. And we're going to need that as well all the days of our lives. Picking back up in verse 20. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show him the interpretation. A great lesson here in this prayer, this thanksgiving of Daniel. When we see God's hand in what is going on in our lives, we need to acknowledge it. We need to thank him as the source and the power of the great things that are manifesting in our lives. But how often are our prayers consumed with supplications and things that we want, things that we think that we need, to the absence, perhaps, of the thanksgiving that we should offer? Let it not be so of us, right? Let us be like Daniel. And here in this passage, he also establishes that he believes this first truth, that God is bigger, right? He's looking at this in a macro view. He's seeing the big picture and saying God's hand is doing things. He's observing perhaps the fact that they are on a yo-yo, which if he had known about a yo-yo back then, that would have been a miracle, I think. But he's acknowledging that he's on this yo-yo, but that it's God's hand that's controlling it, right? And that's the great comfort for us, is that through life's ups and downs, God's in control. His hand is making things happen. His hand is shielding us. His hand is nudging us. His hand is blessing us all the days of our lives, as long as we're walking with and for him. As you know, Daniel interprets this dream, again, much to the delight of the king. And he acknowledges that God is the source of the interpretation, and that he is nothing but a messenger, a conduit of the blessing of the interpretation that the king was so hungry for. We'll skip ahead to verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king and appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. Briefly, another lesson for us here before we get to chapter 3. This yo-yo continues, right? And we have to be ready. One day, these men were looking to be murdered, to be killed by the authorities of Babylon. Essentially, the next day, I don't know how many days passed, but essentially the next day, they're being rewarded, they're being praised, they're being put on a pedestal and given power and authority. We have to be ready for both extremes, right? We can't get spiritual whiplash. We have to be braced and ready for whatever is going to come. Sometimes what seems like a great blessing will come upon us, right? And we're so thankful for it, but we're not ready for it. How many people have gotten riches or power before they were mature enough to handle it and have fallen because of it? So we must be ready as people of God for both extremes, for what we would deem good and what we would deem bad. All right, getting down to the heart of the matter in chapter 3. We'll read through this fairly quickly. But of course, you know the story here. Nebuchadnezzar is going to build a 90-foot idol and command everyone to worship it. And these men are going to say, can't do it. And they're going to speak their two truths that they have hidden in their hearts. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it upon the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent together the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, prefects, and the governors, counselors, treasurers, justices, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that he had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, etc., shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Just a quick lesson for us to learn here. These men, whose lives had been saved by the faith of Daniel and these three young Jews, were jealous, forgot the blessing that had come as a result of them being able to interpret the king's dream, and were turning their backs on these young men for their faith. People are fickle. Darkness hates light, and ultimately that will manifest itself. So don't pat ourselves on the back when we have some success. Use it as a stepping stone for the next battle. All right, verse 13. I didn't show you guys that slide, did I? Okay, verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought, so that they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from out of my hands? Again, people have very short memories. Nebuchadnezzar had been praising the God of Daniel when times were good, but had been given enough time for his arrogance and his pride to surface to the point that he had made an idol and was saying that no one had the power but him. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace and will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Quickly, lessons for us. We are blessed by God. We live in a foreign land where the culture is anything but godly. We live under a government that likes us when it can benefit from us, in disasters, when we pay taxes, etc., but is highly skeptical of us and often antagonistic toward us. In our lives, we see both prosperity and pain and seem to be on a yo-yo string. We must stay ready for both extremes. As we face persecution and pass its tests, our strength and the persecutions may seem to grow together in both power and intensity. But ultimately, if we have two truths in our lives, we will stand strong in whatever lies ahead. Truth 1, God is bigger than my problem. And truth 2, I cannot forsake him. It's ironic that we're not getting to the rest of the story, but in one sense, the rest of the story doesn't matter, because this is the climax of the story. When these young men say, I am not going to forsake my God. If they were killed, they go to heaven's glory. If they live, they're blessing a nation through their faithfulness as Nebuchadnezzar realizes the power of God once again. And isn't that our task as well? Do what's right. If it costs us everything, we go to glory. If not, we stay here and continue to manifest God and glorify him such that we can take as many people with us on our journey. And that ultimately, I think, is the purpose of persecution. Next week, as we said, we'll be on maybe a happier topic, the book of Philippians and the joy that's there. We'll introduce that and get started there in chapter 1. Thanks again for being here. Appreciate your attendance this whole quarter and your contributions to the class.